Chapter 8. John had read several books about deer and deer hunting. One writer would say all deer do this, another would say all deer do that. But in truth, the deer never read the books, and they did as they wanted. Some deer slept at night and fed in the day. Some bedded down during the day and they fed at night. Still others slept and fed intermittently all day and all night. There was not a normal way for deer, John knew, only the deer's way. The deer that John was following bedded often during the day. In a normal 24 hours, she might make 4 or 5 beds, some in darkness, others during the warm part of the day where the sun could get her. After the second near brush with John, she went even farther. She was not yet really alarmed. That much John could see by her tracks. They were still full of purpose, though for a half a mile she stretched them out and covered distance with some great speed. By the time John was well into the first half mile of tracks, the doe was 2 miles away. And this distance gave her time to get out of the escape mentality. He could see the tracks start to settle down and get steady. In nature, John knew danger came with great suddenness. A mouse could be feeding peacefully on a stem of grass 1 second and be in a fox's belly the next instant. 2 grouse could be performing the mating ritual and within a heartbeat come under an owl's silent, slashing attack. But if danger came suddenly, it also left quickly. If the fox misses the mouse, it seldom persists. The owl looks for a whole nother meal. It takes too much precious energy to chase food that's already been forewarned. It's much easier to find prey that can be taken out with little effort, that are off guard. By the time she'd gone those 2 miles, the doe had forgotten all about John. Her tracks settled down, and John followed them slowly and carefully. She knew that he was coming, and he knew he could get her. He knew by her tracks. She would move ahead of him and stay there for a time, but she would forget, and all he had to do was stay on the tracks, and he would get that shot. And if he got a shot, he would get her. He visualized it. She would move and then stop, and he would put the bullet right through her shoulder, and she would begin to stagger sideways and down with the impact. The life would go out of her, out and out, leaving the gray film on her eyes, and he would cut her throat, and the red would flow out of the snow, warm and rich and steaming. He shook his head. It was wrong to project while hunting. Nothing came the way it was supposed to come, and planning just didn't work. You might stand and watch a clearing for hours, waiting for that deer to come out, and it would pass 10 feet behind you, and you would never even know it. He washed his mind clear, took a mouthful of snow to wet his tongue, and replaced some of the moisture he was losing by perspiring. He was not warm, but he knew he was sweating into the clothes because that's what always happened when he worked in the winter. It was noon now. The sun was peaking, and he turned his face towards it as he walked, let the heat warm his cheeks. It would get cold tonight, he thought. Very cold. Maybe 15 or 20 below. He would have to make sure to get that doe early so he could start back home. If he was out much after dark, he would either have to keep moving or stop and build a fire and ride out the cold. He had matches and the sandwiches his grandparents wouldn't even worry, but he knew how to handle himself in the woods, and they knew that. He had a great teacher in his grandfather. Still, he didn't relish the discomfort of standing over a fire all night. He would get that doe early, he decided, work a little harder, and catch up and get a shot. He grunted a bit as he stepped over a windfall. A lair poplar the wind had torn out of the swamp. A poplar is a big tree, like a big oak tree, with a disc of roots sticking in the air. His leg came down and went through the deep snow in the grass and threw him over at an angle. It put him at a really awkward position, and he looked up, and there she stood. She had made a bed on the far side of the windfall where the sun could warm her, protected by the roots from any wind. John's eyes took it all in. The small cupped bed in the grass, still warm and steaming. The sudden flurry of movement, a blur of red-brown as she got up, and the freeze as she just stood. John was leaning to his left while it threw him slightly off balance to stand that way. It did not keep him from being able to use his rifle. She stood there, frozen, eyes wide open, staring at him. He caught her somehow off guard. He was on top of her, and she panicked and froze and just stood, waiting for death. The rifle came up, floated up to his shoulder in a fluid movement, a movement he'd known many times. It happened with great speed, but he visualized it always in slow motion. The rifle coming up, his thumb pulling the hammer back, the bead on the front sight nestling into the sloping buckhorn of the back, the bead coming perfectly to rest on the doe's shoulders where, in the back of the hair and muscle, he knew the heart was there, pulsing, pumping, and beating. His finger tightened on the trigger, and that too was automatic, all part of the same motion, all natural and flowing. The gun up, the hammer back, and the sights on a target, on her heart, on the death, and his finger squeezing and squeezing the trigger to give her that death, to blow her over and down, to make her into the meat that they needed. But he didn't shoot. The moment hung for hours. It burned into him, became part of him, the doe standing side onto him, so close he could see her hairs, eyes wide and clear, little puffs of steam from her nose, a twitch in her back leg from a ready muscle held in check. All of it seen over the blue-black of the rifle barrel. 2 seconds that lasted hours. Just pull the trigger, he thought. Pull it and let the sear drop, and that will let the hammer fall and set off the primer, which will ignite the powder and send the bullet out to take her life, he thought. His finger was tight on the trigger, knuckle tense and white under his mitten, but he didn't shoot. Why am I not shooting? We need the meat, and there it is, and I've been hunted this deer to give her death and to make meat, and it's all here for me, for us. And why aren't I pulling the trigger? Why? The doe moved. Her back foot lifted and stepped forward a couple inches and settled into the snow again, but her head was still. It's the same doe, he thought suddenly, fingers still tight on the trigger. It's the doe from the other night. She remembers me, he thought. She remembers me from the stone boat and from spreading manure and the horses that night. She knows who I am, and that's why she's not running. That's why she's not trying to leave. And he knew that she moved at first, he would have fired and killed her. And he knew that it was getting harder and harder to kill her. Knowing her made it hard to finish the trigger squeeze, and now knowing him made it still even harder. She knows who he is, and still the moment hung suspended, time in the cold, like frozen time. He had not breathed for 20 seconds. Now, and more, holding only half a breath, he let it out with a burst that made an explosive sound. Whew! She jumped. With no gathering of muscle, she exploded up and away and came down 30 feet to the side in a great burst of snow. And then 2 more bounds, and she was out of sight. And still, he did not shoot. The snow was still hanging in the air, drifting down like traces of white flour when he lowered the rifle, staring at her, seeing the image of her still etched in his eyes, the doe standing and the rifle sights were on her, and him not shooting. It made no sense. He was still leaning over the windfall in a bad position. It took him a few seconds to get his leg loose and drag it over the log, then another 2 or 3 to brush all the snow off his leg and clean out the top of his boot. And when he looked back down the trail, he thought he saw an outline of her standing in the willows. He couldn't be sure, but he saw the markings of a deer in the vertical gray, caught in the sun, and then it was gone. He shook his head. Part of all this didn't make sense. Why did he not shoot, and why should she stand to him, stand there for death, just waiting like that? John looked around as if trying to see the answer, and then up at the blue sky and down at the rifle in his hands. And then he started to walk. He followed her trail in the new snow, followed the part of her that was left behind. He did not know why. He knew that he hadn't shot her, and he knew he had wanted to shoot her, and that made no sense at all to him. He did not understand himself, did not know what made him hold the death back. But there was something later for him, something later on down that he wanted to see, to hear, to feel. It all meant more than just deer and the gun and him. It meant something bigger that he couldn't understand just yet. And that's what he thought anyway. But another part of John just told him that he was following her because he really had no choice. He could not hunt another deer, having failed this one, and he could not turn and go home because the job was not finished. He followed the doe's tracks because at that time, that's all there was for him to do, to follow the tracks leading off into the snowy woods. The tracks called him, and he followed.